school board member is an elected position, and in our districts, by and large, very few of the elections are contested. Sometimes some are, but most are not, because it takes a lot of work. There are meetings almost year round. We have 1 month off, and that's in August when we're not meeting. The duty basically is to set policy, to be a liaison between community members and the administration. While our meetings often, in fact usually, do involve school administration, our primary linkage to the school administration is through you. And so we're not reaching into the schools to try to run things and manage things, as much as some principals sometimes get a little itchy about that. But, so I personally see our role very much as a steward of the assets and of the taxing power of the community, to make sure that there's a useful and fair balance between the demands for a successful education and the pocketbook of the community.
Exactly. Now, Carey, you've been on the board for a number of years as well, and now you're serving as chair of Dresden, and I believe you were chair of Norwich at one time in the past. And you have sometimes characterized the role of school board as, maybe labor of love is a bit of an extension, but certainly it's an honor to serve the community. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, it really is, and I think clearly it's a service to our children, to our schools, and to our broader community. And I think one of the nicest parts about it is getting to know some of the very talented people that we have in the district, in the administrative team, but also, I think more particularly on the front lines with our kids, the teachers, the ed assistants, and we're really, I think, blessed in this community to have a terrific group. You mentioned Robin as chairman of the board, and I think there is kind of an analogy there, a business analogy between a board of directors and a CEO. And I think one of the responsibilities of the board is to work directly with the superintendent in terms of evaluations, et cetera, and that's an important obligation of the board as well.
Carey, well, we got you kind of front and center. You're chair of Dresden, and Dresden's kind of a unique entity. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Dresden Compact and how that is so unique?
So Dresden is unique. It's an interstate school district. It was the first such, and I think there are two in the United States today, Rivendell to our north. But it is the coming together of Norwich, Vermont, and Hanover, New Hampshire, and for the upper grades, for the middle school and the high school. I believe, and this is just a sort of a footnote, that I believe it was the last piece of legislation signed into law by President John F. Kennedy. So it dates back to the early 1960s. And it's been a great, I think, relationship for the two towns. Certainly it's served our children very well in their education over a period now of 40 plus years.
Right. And Neil, obviously chair of the Norwich board, your kids go off to Marion Cross and to Richmond Middle School and then on to Hanover High School. And I think actually the percentage is starting to climb up a little bit. Historically it had been like in the low 30s in terms of the number of students in Norwich relative to the whole population. And now I think the number is like 33 or 34%. So it's like Norwich is kind of moving up there.
Yeah, we are. Traditionally, I think that the split's sort of been about 2/3, 1/3. Hanover, Norwich. Norwich is a smaller community. But I think you're right. I think that the numbers have been, I should say either the Norwich numbers are creeping up a little bit or the Hanover numbers are creeping down a little bit, which changes the equation a little bit. Sure. But we're very pleased and very happy with the education that the kids get across the river.
Well, talk to us, Neil, speaking about that. Talk to us about how the budget process, especially in Norwich, what does it include? What's entailed in the budget process? Because you're responsible for some things that occur over the river that come back to you, so to speak. So if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think to your point, it was a bit of a process question there, and then also a little bit of a question about what's included in the Norwich budget.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The budget process actually starts pretty early in the school year. We have a budget committee in Norwich that sits down and takes a look at and figures out what the guidelines should be for the coming year for the budget process. And then that evolves into a first pass by the administrators, school principal, to come up with an initial budget. That comes to the board in early January. There are 3 meetings that happen in 3 consecutive weeks in January, 2 budget discussion meetings, and the third, which was a public hearing and a budget adoption. So by the end of January, we've got this whole thing wrapped up, so to speak. And from a content perspective, what's included in the Norwich budget. So it's not only the cost items associated to run Marion Cross. What is also included in the Norwich budget are transportation costs for students in grades 7 through 12. So the bus service to get the kids across the river to the Richmond Middle School and to the Hanover High School. We also include in the Norwich budget special education costs associated with out-of-district placements. So even for students that are in the higher grades, those costs are included in the Norwich budget, even though those students may be of middle school or high school age. And then finally, we have in the Norwich budget, as does Hanover, the SAU portion that is allotted to Norwich.
Okay, that's good. You got us started. Now let's go a little bit deeper if we could, because I think some folks have questions about the difference between operating budgets and district assessments and total budgets. Maybe we'll start with you, Carey. Help us out. So when we talk about an operating budget, what are we talking about?
So the operating budget would be the cost of running the schools. So this would be the cost of teachers, ed assistants, custodial services, supplies, everything that goes into the running of the schools. But there's an important element which is also revenues. And the Dresden district, for instance, takes in about 100 students typically from other districts. So the biggest piece of that is Lyme, New Hampshire, where they send their children for high school to Hanover High School. But we also take in tuition students from a number of other outlying districts in both New Hampshire and Vermont, and it's a big number. 100 students, it's almost a $2 million revenue item for the Dresden district. In addition, Dresden takes in the tuition from Hanover for educating the 6th graders at the Richmond Middle School. So that also is a revenue piece. And then the town of Hanover contributes about $100,000 every year into the revenues as well. So and this year was a little bit easier for us in terms of revenues because some budget aficionados, if there are such things out there, might recall that for a period of 5 years, the district received money from Dartmouth College. And that was $2 million a year. So we had to shift down from that over a period of years. And then when we thought we were home clear, we also had a sort of an unanticipated 6th grade tuition shortfall. And all that's behind us this year. So this year there was really no revenue shortfall to deal with, which was terrific.
No, that's good. You mentioned the tuitions, and maybe for the folks at home, why would someone want to spend, I think it's $16,000, $17,000 a year to send their children to Hanover High School when certainly they can send their children to high schools in the towns in which they live?
Well, you're putting me in the uncomfortable position of bragging on our district. But and I don't want to say anything about other schools, but I mean, I think our schools, by virtue of their size, if nothing else, are able to offer a lot of programs that I think would be challenging for a smaller district to do. I mean, let's take, for instance, music and art, where you just have to have numbers of students, and I think the district is fortunate to be large enough to offer those kinds of things. And getting back to our teachers, I think we have a very high quality cadre of teaching professionals that's probably the envy of a lot of school districts. But I won't name names.
No, that's good. I appreciate it.
Let me just add something.
By all means.
There's also the co-curricular activities, and we have a vast array of athletic and non-athletic after-school programs, and a lot of families appreciate that, and indeed some of our neighboring towns appreciate that, and send their kids to Hanover High, not just for that, but that's one of the things that's attractive.
Robin, while you've got the floor, can you help us to understand a little bit better? So in the final rendering of the budget, so to speak, we let the folks know what the tax impact is going to be. Can you explain to us in layman's terms, how we get from an operating budget, as Carey explained to us, and then going through district assessments and warrants and all those kinds of things to get to a tax impact? And the reason I ask the question is sometimes the tax impact could be almost negligible, but yet the operating budget is up 3 or 4%, or maybe it's down 3 or 4%. So just to help folks to get a better understanding of that.
Okay. Carey described the operating budget.
Yes.
And in any of the districts, that's sort of the core. That's the first thing that you have to measure up and see what are we going to need to keep the school running and running successfully.
Yep.
Then in Hanover's case, for instance, Carey referred just for a moment to the tuition that we pay to Dresden.
Yep.
Hanover's Ray School is an elementary school which only educates from K, actually pre-K, through 5th grade.
Right.
And then our 6th graders are sent to the Richmond Middle School, and that's run by Dresden.
Right.
So the Hanover district pays the Dresden district
exactly
for that, and so there's an annual charge. It's a per capita tuition rate, and frankly, I'm a little off of your question for just a moment, but that's one of the things that can have a big swing. It so happens that this year it does have a big swing because we have, I think it's a dozen more 6th graders for next year than we have had. Now, of course, even that dozen is uncertain. Right. Because somebody moves into the district or moves out, and that can change. So we're just that item is an important one for the Hanover district, and it's going to be an extra $240,000 this time. So you can see that gets board members' attention. Sure. It is not controllable, but it sure gets our attention. We want to know as closely as we can where that's going to be.
Just a side note on that, if I could. Didn't you guys form a small committee to look at the whole issue of the 6th grade tuition and to see is there a better way for us to formulate that?
Yes. And in fact, there are better ways to formulate it. The historical methodology was subject to introduced artificial swings in the cost, and I think that's been resolved mitigated now. So it's more simply going to vary with the number of students. Let me not get into the math of that.
Sure.
So we have these expenses in Hanover, and any district would have some of them that are not related to operating our elementary school. There's the tuition, which I just described. There are some special ed costs that I think Neil described or mentioned anyway. When some children have needs for which our district is not capable of delivering what they need.
Sure.
So in some cases we have to place them in another school, meaning not the Richmond school either, but sometimes out of district to some special facility that has the capability to serve those kids. That also, by the way, is one of the non-operating expenses that can vary substantially. And unlike the tuition that I harped on or went on at length about, that is something which is very, very difficult to project. You know, when you have a child this year who's going to still be with you next year, and that expense will continue. But again, somebody can come into the district, somebody can be diagnosed with some problem you didn't anticipate. There are ways that people move out. So anyway, that number can vary substantially and somewhat unpredictably. Well, when we get into the warrant articles later, we set aside some money to try to help mitigate that problem in the budget. Now let's see. You had a question, and I was supposed to be addressing it.
Just to tax impact, and so.
Okay. So you have the operating expenditures, and then you have these other expenditures like the tuition or like outplacement of some special ed kids. Then there are revenues. We get revenue from the state. Some of that is what's called CAT aid or catastrophic aid, which also is an offset to last year's special ed costs.
Good point.
There's some federal money that comes in. It's a lot less than the state, and the state gets less each year too, it seems. So, there are revenues that offset the expenditures. There are revenues that come in, unlike running a business, where your revenues are big and you try to keep your expenses small. We have a lot of expenses, and the revenues from the state and the Fed and some incoming tuition never comes near covering that. And therefore, what's left is the net assessment, which is a total dollar amount. And the net assessment is what the taxpayers have to pay. And going from the net, estimating the net assessment is with our assistant superintendent John Aubin. It's not hard for us. It may be hard for him, but it's not hard for us. But once we have the net assessment dollars, taxpayers are naturally interested in how is that going to affect my taxes. And to get to that, there are several other complications, one of which Neil referred to about the number of students in Dresden from Hanover and from Norwich. That's not terribly difficult, but it's a complication. And then the big unknown is what is the tax base in the town, and in this case I'm talking Hanover, but the same thing would be true in Norwich. What is the tax base, and has it changed? If some new businesses or real estate is there, then you have a larger tax base. If not, then not. And that factors in the total tax base. Is what interacting with the net assessment is what determines the tax rate. In the case of Hanover, we're going from projected $11.26 per thousand of valuation to $11.32 per thousand of valuation, and that would be about 0.5%. That's 0.5%.
That's pretty
increase.
Modest. Yeah,
that is pretty modest, and we're fortunate this year to have some revenue offsets that I referred to that are greater than last year.
That's great. Thank you, Robin. And Carey, if you could just add a little bit to that, because I know, for example, when we talk about crafting the budget, there are certain things that are beyond our control, and Robin sort of intimated what those were. So we have healthcare benefits, and those go up sometimes double digit. I think this year it's like 8%. And then you also have retirement, and as folks know, the state of New Hampshire now has moved away from providing any support for the retirement system, and now it's all on the shoulders of the local school district. So that's another increase of 10 or 11%. And so my point being that when you start adding all those percentages up from outside forces, it artificially inflates your budget.
It does. In fact, for the last few years, we've taken into account the historical rate of increases of some of those items, which are very difficult, if not impossible, for the district to control, such as healthcare costs. Although we do make efforts actually to try and contain that, and then also retirement, et cetera. So we take those into account as, okay, here's a few things that are coming our way. And so the budget guidelines for this year, for instance, for the Dresden district were, I want to say, 2.25% to 2.75% increase, just by virtue of those known increases. Now, some of those came in less. The healthcare is going up. It is an inflationary pressure, but it's less than we feared. And special ed costs, which have historically grown something like 8% per year in the districts, this year it's a very different story. And some of that might be the specific census of children, but I think a lot of it has to do with the administrators looking at ways of delivery that can be different. Part of that's technology, part of that's how they assign people. And so there have been some significant cost savings this year in the special ed area for the Dresden district, which is helping to bring down the total cost.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we'll come back to that when we talk about how we craft the budget, because I think the principals, the SPED director, and others have taken a hard line in terms of looking at that and saying, is there a more creative way to see how we can move staff around and define our programs in a means that is good for the kids, but at the same time economically prudent. But we'll get back to that. Let's move to Neil, if we could. So Robin had sort of introduced this theme, and that is you got a lot of things that are interacting with the budget and what really is of concern to us. And so, Neil, when you look at your budget in the town of Norwich for the Norwich school system, what are some of the challenges that you've had to face in crafting this budget?
I think it's the same challenges that we've faced, in recent years. I mean, there's been the economy certainly is a huge factor in this, and the realization that we want to be able to offer, a top-notch education, which we do in Norwich, but we need to be conscious of the costs associated with that. And so, once again, this year there was a lot of focus on keeping things affordable, yet maintaining the quality of the program. One of the factors that we have in play in Norwich is something called the excess spending threshold. Whereby through calculations, if we exceed that amount, that's a bad thing for the district. And so we attempted last year, I should say, we were modestly close to meeting that limit, and so it was on the top of our minds this year throughout the budget process. not to exceed that amount. If we do, every dollar that we raise above that for Marion Cross, another dollar also goes to the state of Vermont. So we did our best and came in well under the mark this year with plenty of room to spare. So that was a primary concern during the budgeting season, and I think that we passed that one fairly well.
Sure. And Carey had alluded to, quality. I think he had said that in Dresden we're able to attract the best and the brightest, and we have very good staff. And I think the point should be made that in Norwich, I know you folks went out of your way to really look at how are we going to get a new principal in our building and what kind of person are we looking for. And it was a long process, as I recall. So if you could just walk us through that and tell us, how you feel about how that new principal has impacted your school. It sort of goes to Carey's point about quality.
Yep. So I will say I was very pleased with how the process went for the principal search at Norwich. And I will say I think the benefit being is that by the time that we were doing that search, we'd already gone through 2 or 3 others. So we
got pretty good at it.
We had the routine down pretty well by that point. But I was really heartened, really amazed by the amount of community involvement that we had throughout this entire process. From early on, we met with the community to find out what they wanted in a principal at Marion Cross. And then at the point in time when we had candidates come through for interviews, there were 2 community sessions for each of the candidates. We had one in the morning and one in the afternoon, and both were extremely well attended. We had community members that actually served on the steering committee that were involved in vetting a lot of the candidates. And in the end, as most everyone knows, we selected Bill Hammond as the next principal at Marion Cross. Honestly, I don't think there was a single person out there that didn't vote for Bill. He was by far the best candidate for the position. And since day one, he's fit in like he's been there for a really long time. And so we're quite pleased with how things have worked out this year. Bill's done a fabulous job being a brand new principal. This is his first principalship position. We couldn't have asked for anything better. So we're extremely pleased with how well Bill has done this year, and very happy for all the community involvement and support that we had throughout the process.
No, I think that's very true, and I know, Robin, you were involved in the search process for the principal at the high school, and obviously, Carey, it's your principal at Hanover High School, and it goes back again to this whole issue of crafting the budget. You have quality people who can look at your budget and say, is there a better way? And you talked a little bit earlier about more assistive technology in the area of special education. Maybe that lessens the need for educational assistance, and so I know at the high school that number has dropped. Maybe 2, 3, or 4. I know that number's also dropped at the Ray School as we look more at, is there a better way to repackage or rethink how we're going to provide services for those kids? And not necessarily just special ed kids, but all kids who might need help in some way or another. So that's obviously been a big factor. But, again, it goes back to quality. Do you have the right kind of people in place who have the wherewithal and the creativity, if you will, to kind of look at their program and say, is there a way for us to massage this or repackage or redefine it in such a way that we are getting the quality we want, but at less cost? And I think you found that at Dresden. If you could just talk a little bit about the fact that your enrollments are down a little bit, more at Richmond than they are at at Hanover High School. However, there have been adjustments in the faculty at both schools.
There have been, and just to put the enrollment in context, the combined enrollment between the 2 schools is dropping from 1,146 to 1,119. I believe the number is 24 fewer students at the middle school. And then at Hanover High School, it's a modest drop. I want to say it's maybe half a dozen, but it's a small number. And so, but we are reducing staff at both schools. I believe the number is something like 1.5 at the middle school and 6.5 or thereabouts at the high school. And those, of course, the way this is done, it's not necessarily 6.5 people. Of course, you can't have a half person, but they're portions of jobs that are carved, or trimmed, et cetera. And it's not necessarily people who are being letting go. In many cases, it's taking advantage of retirements or people who want to reduce hours or add hours. So there's lots of flexibility there. And I think it's typically done in a way that meets not just the needs of the community in terms of what are the fiscal constraints, but typically it's done in a way that it's not very onerous in terms of the cost to personnel. personnel.
Right.
But those are significant reductions, which are helping to keep the budget flat this year at Dresden, which I know you're going to ask about next.
Okay. Go for it.
Okay, so the budget is flat at Dresden. It's $23,233,000.
Yep.
And that's, I think it's maybe 11,000. So call it flat versus last year, and that reflects those trims to costs.
Sure.
Notwithstanding the pressures from the higher retirement expense and higher health care, et cetera, and general inflation. So I think it was a very diligent effort on the part of the administrative team to curb costs where they could.
Sure.
Partly there was the opportunity with reduced students, primarily at the middle school, but partly it's, as you pointed out in your question, it's really looking at things a little bit differently and seeing if there aren't ways to deliver quality education at a slightly more affordable cost.
No, that's great, and I think you're looking at the same thing in Hanover. And in fact, you guys were looking at your building and saying, "Okay, we have programs, we have issues. Is there a way for us to do this, but not keep coming back to the taxpayer year after year?" And so I know there's a warrant out there right now for I think $50,000 to look at architectural fees and engineering drawings to consider an addition and a renovation of the Ray School. If you could just talk a little bit about that.
That's right. The warrant article is for $50,000 to do an engineering study.
Right.
The engineering study, if it's approved by the voters,
right,
will take a look at how and where the physical configuration can be improved. Now,
right.
We've had at the Ray School in Hanover, we've had a number of facilities issues that have needed attention for several years. I've been on the board for 8 years, and I can't remember how many. It's been a good number of years that principals have been coming to us and saying, we need this and we need that. We say, yeah, but maybe next year we can figure out how to do that.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, next year is here.
Right.
And so there are repairs, call them maintenance and repairs that are really needed, and that's one aspect. And the other issue is whether to undertake some expansion of the Ray School.
Right.
Now, some viewers may wonder why we'd be looking for expansion of the facility when our enrollment numbers have been down for some years. There are basically two things going on there, and I should say the expansion is not a done deal.
Right.
The expansion is something under consideration.
Right.
One factor in that, aside from the need for maintenance and repairs.
Sure.
One factor in that is the possibility for going from a half-day kindergarten to a full-day kindergarten.
Right.
That would take staff, and that will take physical space.
Exactly, yeah.
So that's a factor, and I don't know if you're going to be asking about that later, but since I've raised it, I'll say there's a committee studying that, and the administration is very soon going to be coming back to the committee with estimates of
costs and things,
and operational issues
right.
About that. The other thing that may demand additional space is there's a program to try to make more efficient special ed programs.
Right.
And there's an acronym which is
NECC.
called NEC. NECC, we call it NEC. And don't ask me what it is. It's a New England Child something.
Yep.
And so the NEC idea goes like this. We referred earlier to outplacement of some special ed kids who have special needs that we in the district are not able to deliver. Under the NEC program, if it moves forward and so forth, we would seek and presumably achieve certification to be able to take in students and deliver those extra services. This would have two benefits. One is that some Hanover students who would otherwise be placed outside of the district at very high cost would then be able to be served within the district in the NEC program.
Exactly.
And that would take some space. The second dimension, there are many dimensions, but the second important feature of the NEC program is that if established, once established, it would also permit us, if we chose to take in some students from outside the district so that some presumably nearby district that had to do an outplacement to serve its special ed students would place them in Hanover in the NEC program, and that would be revenue, of course, to
Sure.
Hanover.
Yeah.
So it could, if this is
speculative.
It's tentative in a way, but it's on track and kind
Sure.
of moving along.
Yeah. Neil, you want to respond to that? Don't you have somebody in at the Norwich at Marion Cross who might benefit from being in the program?
Oh, yeah. So there is some benefit to be gained here from all of the districts from the work that is being pursued across the river.
Yeah.
So, we're certainly very hopeful that moves forward and that we're able to get, the licensure, the accreditation associated with that. I think it's going to be a benefit for all three districts.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
It's great. Well, we got you on the floor. So, Robin was talking about the addition at the Ray School and the renovations and things that have to happen, and you don't want to go back to the taxpayer year after year after year.
Right.
I think you guys were faced with some of those considerations as well.
We were, and I'd like to just take a moment because I want folks to. I'd like to cover just a little bit of the Norwich budget first before I jump into our bond article. Just so that folks understand sort of where everything sits with all this. So the Norwich budget right now is proposed at $5,163,548.
Wow.
That's just over $261,000 greater than last year's budget, about a 5.3% increase.
Yep.
There's another figure, though, that I also like folks to take a look at, and that is it's a key Vermont indicator that we use throughout the tax rate calculation, which is ed spending per pupil.
Right.
And if you look at that figure, so the expenditures taking into account all of the revenues divided by the number of equalized pupils, that figure's up just over 2%. So you could say that the expenditure budget is up just over 5%, but if you look at ed spending per pupil on the Norwich side, it's up just over 2%.
Right.
The majority of the increase on the Norwich side is actually due to special ed costs and some building maintenance items.
Right.
So that leads me to the discussion of the building maintenance items.
Hold that thought for a second.
Yep,
so go back
absolutely.
to special education, because you said a lot of it's special ed, but don't you in the state of Vermont get a huge recompense from the state at the end?
We do, yeah. So Vermont does a great job of reimbursing us for special education expenses. And so while we're looking at, I think, just over $170,000 worth of special education expense, we do project to get a fair share of that. I think somewhere around $130,000, $140,000 of that back in revenue from the state of Vermont.
Yeah, that's great.
Vermont, I think, handles that quite nicely.
Yes.
So
that's a hint, Robin.
So to continue on,
we have wonderful legislators, and they do all they can for us, Frank.
As do we. But I want to then move on to those items that we said were building maintenance items. So over the past few years, primarily because of the tight economy, we've been really, really frugal with the budget on the Norwich side, to the extent that we have deferred some building maintenance items that we probably really should have addressed at the time. So this year during the budget process, we looked at what the building really needs. There were some very big ticket items that really needed to be addressed. Those were ERUs, short for energy recovery units. Those handle fresh air intake into the building to make sure that everybody's breathing some good fresh air in the building. And also another item that's called univents, which handle heating in the classrooms or other parts of the building. We had 7 ERUs and I believe 12 univents that needed to be replaced, and they're not cheap.
Right.
So what the Norwich board looked at this year was the idea that we propose a bond article to cover the purchase and installation of all of those items, in addition to repairs that we needed to the gym roof, or that section of the building that covers the gym. That totaled to be about $450,000.
Right.
So this year, voters will see an article on the warrant, on the ballot, for a $450,000 bond to cover the costs associated with the ERU replacements, the univent replacements, and work to fix the roof.
So, question I think the voters might have, so that sounds great, but what's the timeline on this, Neil? So, suppose you do get the bond, how quickly will you be able to get all these things done, and will it interfere with the operation of the school?
So the last part of your question, will it interfere with the operation of the school? No, absolutely not. We've been working with both John Aubin and Jonathan Brush, facilities director, and both of those guys said that if approved, all of this work can be handled this summer.
So you're saying the kids will be able to come back to school on September 1st and this will all be done?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
And this is a benefit to the taxpayer because you're going to be saving money by doing it all now versus kind of piddling it along over 5 years.
Yep, so there's two aspects of that as far as savings go. One is that we do get some measure of savings by doing all of this at one time.
Sure.
But the other measure of savings too is that prior to the introduction of this bond article, we had set aside in the budget some monies to do one ERU, one Univent, and to put some money away towards the roof project that we knew that we needed to do in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, good.
That money now comes out of the budget because it's included in the bond. So there is some measure of cost savings, I want to say in the neighborhood of $25,000, $27,000 that we will save this year on the Marion Cross budget if the bond article were to be approved.
No, that's an excellent point. I think folks may not catch that. I'm glad you mentioned that. Robin, so we've had some specificity in the two budgets over here. Is there anything specifically you want to talk about with your budget?
Boy, there are loads of things. But very quickly, Neil, I was just reminded by Neil's remarks about the bond.
Yeah.
That the renovation and possible expansion project that I was talking about will come up, if we go ahead with that, it will come up just at the time when the old mortgage, the bond that we had years ago, will be maturing.
Right.
So that it won't be dollar for dollar the same, but there will not be, if we go ahead with the project and if we get a bond approved, and if, it should be a fairly smooth transition without a bump in the tax rate or other expenditures. So I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to say that going back to the very early part of our conversation, the operating budget of the Ray School is projected to be down a little bit. It's not much. It's 1.5%, but anytime we can go down 1.5%.
We need to trumpet that, yes.
Well, we think it's better than going up.
For sure.
Now, as I also, without reciting all of it again, there are the various other items that are not in the operating budget, and those are not being quite so gentle with us. Some of them have been referred to with regard to Dresden, for instance, the same health care costs that Dresden faced, we face the same. If the teachers' contracts, and you're going to want to get into that. If the contracts pass, Dresden and Hanover teachers are under the same contract, and also the ed assistants, and also the service employees. So if that all passes, it won't have exactly equal dollar impacts on the two districts, but it'll have similar effects, which are not always shared, which are shared in a different way. I already talked about the tax rate. So I guess unless you something particularly you wanted me to fill in on.
Well, I think you've kept your teacher ratio pretty much the same as it is with
enrollment. You want me to go to the let's see. One of the difficult things, we've talked a little bit about enrollment and enrollment projections, and of the things that we wrestle with at budget time, and trying to estimate what next year's enrollments are going to be is difficult.
Let me interrupt you for a second because I know you're in an awkward position. So in the Dresden and in Norwich, when the numbers came in, they were almost exact. I mean, they were maybe 1 or 2 under or 1 or 2 over what the projections were. Unfortunately for Hanover, when the NHSBA numbers came out, they were skewed. I mean, I think we had a 26 or 25 point differential, if you will, in terms of what the NHSBA said and what we actually ended up with. And so that made it difficult for you to be able to project forward because you weren't sure what you're going to get.
The project last year, a year ago's budget discussion, we had projections from the NHSBA, that's the School Board Association, and we retained them to crunch some numbers and make a projection. And they came in with a number, I think at that time, of 426 or so. We ended up in
431.
431. Sorry, thank you. 431, and we ended up in September with 457.
Yep.
And right now we have 461.
Right.
So that even during the year, that's not 457 to 461 is not immense, and it's not causing a problem.
Sure.
But it's illustrative of how fluid our enrollment situation is.
Exactly.
I think this is more fluid in Hanover than it is in many communities.
I think you're right.
And the reason that I think that is that there are people coming and going, for instance, to Dartmouth College, who are come in for as a visiting professor or something or other. They have kids with them. We have to educate them. A few years later, some of them will then move on to another appointment. So that makes a very fluid situation. Very, very hard to to really expect. There seems to be, and this is, I think, part of what the NHSBA projections are based on. There is, both locally and nationally, a fairly well-established long-term trend towards smaller families. And so that's what I think is making the numbers, the projected numbers, going down, and whether that will, this year or next year or some year, whether that trend will have more traction on us locally than it has very recently. Who knows? It's a long way of saying that enrollments are very difficult to project. NHSBA this year, I think I mentioned 426. I think that's the number that they are projecting now for next year. We, the board, the Hanover board, did not proceed on that number. We proceeded on a 440, which is higher than their projection, but still down than from what our current actual is. And so there's a little not risk, but there's a little dissonance there about whether how far to go toward their projection and how far to go toward where we are right now and all that. If the 440 that the board used for its discussion, if that materializes, and if we are maintaining the same classroom teaching staff, that would say 24 classrooms, plus the specials and other teachers, but 24 classroom teachers. That will be a average classroom size of 18.3. And as you know very well, Frank, the average is just the average. Each classroom will differ from that. And it's grade by grade, it's hard to sort that out. We try to make it come out pretty even, but you can't make it that way. But that will be the 18.3 will be lower than our historical class size, and I think our administration feels that it's more appropriate.
Okay. Thank you. That's good. I want to shift our attention, if we could, to community, and let's start with the Finance Committee. As you know, the Finance Committees in the three districts do come in, weigh in terms of the budget, and offer some insight and commentary for the board, and hope that it'll be reflective of where everyone wants to go. And we're not always in the same place. I think in many years the Finance Committee might come in with one set of objectives and projections, and obviously the boards come in with something else. But I think it's a little bit different this year. So let's start with Carey in Dresden, and talk to us about our relationship with the Finance Committee this year and how things played out.
Sure, thanks, Frank. And first of all, let me just say that we really appreciate the efforts of the Finance Committees. They play a really valuable role between the community and the schools, and I think the school board does that too. We try to balance the needs of taxpayers versus the needs of students and families. But the Finance Committee plays an important role. And this year they did vote to support the Dresden budget by 7-1. I believe was the vote. So we are appreciative of their support. I think, and I'm not going to speak on their behalf, but I think that vote most likely does reflect the hard work of the administrators in containing costs this year. So, but anyway, we thank the Finance Committee for their support.
Great. And Neil, in your case?
So we also had a favorable position from the Norwich Finance Committee. They voted 4-0 in support of the Norwich budget this year. I think one thing to note is that there was one member absent per that vote, and they also have 2 vacant seats currently on the Norwich Finance Committee.
That's very good news.
It's very good news. Yeah, we're very. I mean, I think the Finance Committee does a great job in Norwich. So we're very happy this year to have their support on the budget.
And Robin, you also had favorable response?
Not to be left out, we have a Finance Committee too. And the Hanover Finance Committee has also voted to support our budget.
Good.
We're pleased with.
And I think one thing to be noted, both in Norwich and in Hanover, the community response, if you will, to the schools has been enormous. I know Lauren Rim, who serves on the board, travels around the country and goes to various school systems, and she commented to me that you just don't see this in other districts. There's a level of trust on the part of the community, and there's a level of interest on the part of the community. They come to a lot of events, and when you ask them to respond, whether it's a survey or other kinds of considerations, they're there, and they tell you, what they think about things, and they're invested, I guess is the best way to describe that. But Carey, could you just talk a little bit about, your history on the board and how the community has been such a player?
Well, I think the support that the community gives to our schools is a reflection of the communities, and obviously with Dartmouth College, the DHMC, the Medical Center, we have, and the many sort of private sector firms that have spawned around those, whether they're engineering firms, et cetera, biomedical. There's a lot of interest in education because we have a very high proportion of highly educated people.
Sure.
They clearly value that, and they want their children to to be well educated as well. So I think that's kind of where it stems from. But it is a very collaborative, participative. I mean, Neil talked about the participation of the community in terms of helping to select new leaders for our schools.
Sure.
So it's terrific that they come in. They provide a lot of assistance, and they're literally in our schools. We have doctors come in at Mary Cross and work on dissections and all kinds of things, which is really amazing. It's a great resource for our schools.
And with that interest and with that support comes expectations, and so the community has high expectations for what goes on in our schools. Can you talk to us a little bit about any initiatives that might be going on in the Dresden School District?
Sure. Well, so let me talk about the middle school first.
Sure.
The middle school is really taking the lead in trying to integrate technology within the curriculum. And so there is an effort underway, primarily through the use of iPads, to introduce a personalized technology that's transportable, that's easy to integrate into the community. And so the Richmond Middle School is experimenting with this. The Dresden board authorized last year additional human resources and machine resources to make that happen. They're included in this year's budget is an additional amount of expenditure, a fair bit less than last year, but still another step forward for the middle school in terms of number of iPads, et cetera. And I think we'll see how this goes, but I think it's clearly a direction that is happening nationally, and we'd like our schools to be in the forefront of this.
Sure.
At the high school, they're also rolling out technology. I'd say it's a little bit different flavor than the middle school, but they are very serious about rolling that out as well. And there's also they're making an investment next year in a second, help me if I get this wrong, numerically controlled 3D machine. CNC. Okay, thank you. So that's an additional direction that Hanover High School is taking. At the high school, they are in the midst of their 10-year accreditation process. This is the NEASC, the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, which is coming in, and that's really culminating this spring with what's called the visitation. It sounds very Catholic.
Sounds closely.
So I know there's a lot of hard work going on at the high school to prepare for that, and I think beyond the mere accreditation. I mean, I shouldn't say the mere accreditation because it's an awful lot of work, but I think there's a secondary opportunity there for the high school community, the community at large, to really think about what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, areas where we can improve. So it's a nice opportunity to reflect for everybody. So that's a major effort that's underway at the high school.
Yeah, I mean, certainly everyone can look and say, okay, what have we done well and what do we need to improve on? But I think it should be noted that there's a lot of great things that happen at Hanover High School, and one thing that's just been released is the number of presidential scholars that are recognized by Washington, D.C., and they vary from state to state. And then what they do is they list the schools and how many students from each school are recognized as presidential scholars. So if you look at the state of New Hampshire, and I haven't seen Vermont yet, but if you look at the state of New Hampshire, you'll find that every school, every public school, has at the most 2. I believe St. Paul's had 5 or 6, and I believe Phillips Exeter had 8 or 9. But there was one school that had 11, and that was Hanover High School. So that's very impressive. 3 of the students who received that accommodation also were from Norwich. So it's heartening to know that our kids across the river, as well as the ones in the Hanover area, are doing equally well on these kinds of standardized measures and recognitions throughout the country. Neil, I want to go back to you for a second, if I could, in talking about initiatives. And you're doing something that I don't think board chairs normally do. You're going around with the building principal doing walkthroughs. Can you talk to us about that?
I am. Yep. So one of the things that I mean, this was just a personal initiative of mine. I wanted to get a better sense of what was going on in the building. For 2 reasons. I mean, when we have obviously a brand new principal, I wanted to see how he was adjusting to his new role in the building, and to make sure that he had all the support that he needed, from the board that we could offer to make sure that he was successful in his first year. But on top of that, and somewhat related to the long-range plan, in my work on the staff goal group, is I just wanted to get a better sense of what goes on in the school on a daily basis. I didn't want to be that board member that was only at the board meetings and whose staff felt didn't understand what was going on within the building. And so I thought, what better way to do that possibly than to join Bill on some of his walkthroughs as he visits each of the classrooms, and just to observe what's going on in the classrooms and what the teachers are doing, how the students are interacting with the teachers. And it's been a very positive experience, and I've really enjoyed it. And my hope is, maybe by the end of the school year to have at least seen every class at least once.
Wow, that's impressive. Now, I think, Robin, you've had some opportunities like that as well.
Well, I have some opportunities. It's very limited, but I have. You took me on a tour. Frank took me to the Ray School, and it was very useful. And we spent some time in. This was in conjunction with the issues around kindergarten, the kindergarten program, and so it was useful for me to actually be in some kindergartens. I was in a kindergarten many years ago, but this was a return engagement as an observer, and it was interesting. I'll just throw in a side note, Frank, that you've heard me say in another meeting, that it was particularly interesting afterward to debrief you on what you had observed, because you're an educator, you've been a teacher, you've been a principal, you've been superintendent, and so I learned quite a bit from you. One other thing I want to squeeze in here, Frank, with regard to initiatives.
Yes.
And that is that one of the things that is affecting all our districts is the initiative for getting very serious about staff evaluation. And this is one of your projects, and you are spearheading it.
Thank you.
And you're making it work very well. And I want the public to just hear that, because there is more evaluation, there are more walkthroughs by the principals, assistant principals, by the superintendent, sometimes by board chairs. And anyway, that's a really seriously different activity from our historical norms, and I think it's already bearing fruit. I've heard teachers saying they like it more, they feel like they're being paid attention to, and anyway, I just want the public to be aware of that.
Well, thank you. That's good. That's good to know. And on that note, let's talk about our teachers. And obviously, we feel very strongly about the quality of teachers that we have here, and certainly we want to have a good support system and a good accountability system so that we can talk to our public about the quality of our teachers and why we feel so strongly about them. And to that end, obviously, we have to deal with union contracts that come up from time to time. So, Carey, I know we had a couple of contracts in the Dresden district.
So we had 3. One of those unions is common to the Hanover school system as well, which is the Hanover Education Association, which is our teachers, but also the Hanover support staff, which is the ed assistants, and the service employees, which is the custodial staff. So we did reach agreement with all 3 unions for a three-year period. With respect to the teachers' contract, I know Robin may want to comment on this as well, but they've gone 2 years with no contract, which means no base increases, no steps. And so we're happy to have reached an agreement with them. And Robin, do you want to jump in there in terms of the terms, the increases, et cetera?
Well, only to say that the 3 years of 2% increases seems to me well within reasonable bounds. That's about what CPI has been running at. I would also mention that part of the negotiated contract also has a reduction from 4% to 3% matching contribution to the retirement plan. So, we're going to save a lot of money on that. And this is something that was a subject in our negotiations of great debate, and so we're happy and grateful that we were able to come to agreement with the teachers on that.
Yeah, and Neil, you had a contract too, right?
We did. So we have we've come to an agreement with our teachers. It's a 2-year agreement. Provides for 2.25% total new money in each of the 2 years. And when we say total new money, that includes steps plus base increases. Some changes to personal and professional day allotment. But those were the big cost items for that.
We only have a few minutes left in the show, so why don't we do this to kind of close it out. Let's just have each person talk for 30 seconds or so about, this year's budget process and how they feel about how things went. And we'll start with you, Robin.
I think the budget process went, my job as chair was easier this year than it was last year. Let me say that.
Okay.
Part of that is that we resolved some issues earlier in the the season. Set those aside so we could save our real tussles for the for a fewer number of items. I think that I guess I said the process went well, and I was in a minority with regard to the budget.
Sure.
But when you're on a board, it's not your board; you're one of many.
Sure.
And that's the way it goes.
Okay. Good. Neil.
I also thought that the budget process this year went very smoothly. We came into this with very big concerns about the excess spending threshold.
Right.
The way that things turned out, it ended up not being a concern for us.
Right.
And I think we've got a very reasonable budget this year that provides an excellent quality of education at a reasonable cost. And additionally, we hope that voters will take serious consideration of the bond article as well.
Terrific. Thank you. Carey?
Yeah, I'd say the process went swimmingly. We really were fortunate in that some things broke our ways, but I think more importantly, and the bigger element was the very hard work the administrators did to see if there were some cost savings. So we're very happy to deliver a product to the voters that will be a flat assessment for a large sum of money, but we're delivering it flat, which is terrific. And as has been mentioned here, would really appreciate the endorsement of the public, not just on the budget, but on the union contracts as well.
Sure. And most importantly, folks, come to the district meeting, come out to vote. Obviously, we want to hear what you have to say. You make this thing work, really. It's all about the community. So we hope that folks will take it seriously and look at what we've put out there and consult our websites, talk to your board members. You'll be getting flyers and mailers coming your way. So you should have ample opportunity to be able to dissect the budget and understand any of the questions or issues that are out there. And
March 5th. Don't forget to mention March 5th.
March 5th. Thank you. And thanks to our distinguished panel, and appreciate all the work you do on behalf of the schools and the community you serve. Thank you all.
Thank you, Frank.
Yep.